The Texas Phantom, the police unsuccessfully closed dozens of cases and eventually, all investigations ground to a halt. But one thing remained constant. Once a year, someone would disappear. Always at night, always on the outskirts or in the old forest bordering the village. People were afraid, but over time they got used to living with their fear, turning their anxieties into eerie campfire leg 2004. It all started with Melanie Grace, a 19-year-old student. She had come from the city to spend her vacation with relatives. One night, Melanie decided to take a walk to the river. By morning, she was gone. 2 days later, her body was found on an old farm. It was mutilated, her fingers missing, and beside her lay a strange note. "Consider this a warning." The police scoured the entire area, questioning locals, but there were no leads. Who could have done such a thing remained a mystery. Everyone thought it was a random criminal until 3 months later another person disappeared. This time it was George, a farmer who went into the forest to gather firewood. His body was found a week later, in the same position as Melanie's. And again there was a note. "You won't see me, but I'm closer than you think." 2024 years after the first crimes, the maniac was still at large. The villagers had grown accustomed to their fear, but urban journalists would occasionally visit the village, hoping to uncover new details. One such reporter was Laura Burns, a young journalist from Austin. Her colleague and friend Michael had recently become one of the Phantom's victims. Laura decided to conduct. She started by studying police archives. What struck her was how little information there was. Every time a body was found, there were virtually no clues at the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no footprints, nothing. The maniac seemed to erase all traces, leaving behind only fear and his ominous notes. The locals were reluctant to share their stories. Henry, an old man who had lived in the village his entire life, told Laura that the maniac was connected to the forest. An old Texas legend spoke of a curse. It was said that hunters once lived there, offering sacrifices to forest spirits to protect their land. According to the legend, one of them became immortal. Guy. "When I was a boy," Henry recalled, "I saw him. At the edge of the woods, a tall man wearing a mask made of coyote skin. He looked at me, with a stare that freezes your bones." Ivan Laura decided to venture into the forest. She brought a camera, a voice recorder, and a flashlight. The deeper she went, the more bizarre the signs became. Symbols had been carved into the trees. The wind howled after several hours of wandering. Laura stumbled upon an old hunting cabin. Inside, the air reeked of dampness and decay. Photographs hung on the walls. Each of the maniac's victims had been captured in those images, and nearby were belongings that had once been theirs. A few days later, the police found the cabin. Inside, they discovered photographs, symbols, and old belongings. But neither Laura's body nor her camera was ever recovered. On the wall, a note remained. "I am always near. You just don't want to see." Laura's story became the final chapter in the long chain of murders attributed to the Texas Phantom. Despite all the police's efforts, the maniac remained a legend, one that, the 4 after Laura Burns's disappearance, her colleagues raised an outcry. The story of the Texas Phantom once again dominated newspaper headlines. The police were forced to reopen the case, but chaos arose from the start. The cabin where Laura had left her final traces was set on fire the day after its discovery. All potential evidence was destroyed, and the culprit, Baha'i Captain James Harper, who led the investigation, tried to piece together the remaining fragments of evidence. From the ashes, he managed to salvage charred remnants of photographs and symbols, but none of the experts could identify their origins. The symbols carved into the trees and walls didn't resemble anything familiar. Neither Native American markings, no. The locals retreated into their homes once again. No one wanted to talk to the police or journalists. People felt that the Phantom was angry now, and they feared he might go beyond just killing. The journalist team a month later, a group of independent documentarians arrived in the village. Their leader was a reporter named Tom Carter, who had once worked with Laura. He didn't believe in the supernatural, though he respected the locals' fear. To him, The Texas Phantom was a clever serial killer who skillfully exploited people's fears and the peculiarities of the area to cover his tracks. Tom decided not to follow the standard investigative path. Instead, he turned to the old legends tied to the forest. After studying archives, he discovered that the area where the murders occurred had a dark history. In the early 20th century, a hermit lived there, someone the locals called the Hunter. Rumor had it that he worshipped something he called the power of the forest. After his death, houses in the village began to burn, and people started disappearing. Those who tried to investigate were also found dead. Tom and his team began their investigation by setting up hidden cameras throughout the forest. They were convinced that the killer was still lurking nearby. The first night passed without incident, but by morning, they discovered that all the cameras had either been destroyed or disappeared. They decided to try another approach. The forest contained old underground tunnels once used by hunters and smugglers many years ago. One of the tunnel entrances was located a few miles from the village. Tom theorized that the Phantom might be using these tunnels to move undetected. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they descended underground. The tunnels were long and confusing, as if someone had intentionally designed them to be a maze. Carved symbols appeared on the walls again. In one of the corridors, they stumbled upon a storage room. On the old shelves lay belongings of the missing victims, but the most terrifying discovery awaited them. Hanging on the wall was a photograph of Laura Burns. Beneath it was her recorder. It was still operational. Tom pressed play. "Today, I found that cabin." Laura's voice trembled with fear. "I think I'm close to solving this. If anyone hears this, know that he's watching. He's not human. This can't be human." The recording abruptly ended with the sound of approaching footsteps. The tunnels grew darker. The tunnels became even more foreboding. The air grew heavy, and the flashlights started flickering erratically. Kevin, a young cameraman, began muttering that he felt as though someone was following them. Minutes later, a dull thud echoed from behind. Turning around, they saw the entrance to the tunnel had been sealed off. Tom realized it was a trap. They frantically searched for another exit, but the deeper they went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. In one of the chambers, they stumbled upon a massive wooden table. On it lay tools resembling old hunting knives and scalpels, all covered in dried blood. But what drew their attention most was a fresh note resting on the table. "Your eyes do not see, but your soul knows." Suddenly, footsteps echoed from behind them. Standing at the entrance to the room was the figure, a man wearing a mask made of coyote hide. He was massive, his presence filling the entire space. Tom and his team froze, paralyzed by sheer terror. In a deep, resonant voice, the man said, "You did not come here for the truth. You came for fear, and fear you shall have." At that moment, the flashlights went out entirely, and the tunnel was consumed by darkness. The silence was broken by screams, the sounds of a struggle, and then nothing. The aftermath: weeks later, a rescue team ventured into the tunnels, but Tom and his team were never found. The only thing recovered was a recorder with their final audio. Tom's last words on the tape were, "He's watching, he's waiting." The tunnels were subsequently sealed, and the village was abandoned for good. The remaining residents dispersed, unwilling to stay in a place haunted by the presence of the Texas Phantom, or whatever dark force resided there. 1 year later, a new note was discovered 100 miles from the abandoned village, nailed to a tree. The forest remembers. Do you? The Phantom remained as elusive as ever, and his legend endures, striking fear into the hearts of those who dare to approach the cursed forest's borders.